Hello, everybody. A warm welcome, either from across the road or from across the country, depending. Welcome to St. Louis. It's good for me to be back. And my name is John McCaffrey. I'm a professor of philosophy, an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. I was, previous to that, a postdoc in the philosophy, neuroscience, psychology program, working with this man, Carl Kraver, here, which was fantastic. And the community here was amazing, both in philosophy and in psych and brain sciences. And so I'm really happy to be here, kicking off this conference for you guys today. The conference, Fitting the Mind to the Brain, Deliberations on Cognitive Ontology, is a collaborative effort between a grant from the Duke Summer Seminars in Neuroscience and Philosophy, funded through the John Templeton Foundation in collaboration with the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences and the Departments of Philosophy and Psych and Brain Sciences here. So this is a topic that I find really interesting, and about a year and a half ago, got to organizing this workshop. What I'm going to do in this intro, a little bit of intellectual content, just to set the stage for the sorts of conversations that we will be having throughout the conference, and a little bit of publicity, just repping people who are here and who are going to be talking, and then a little bit of logistics and thanking people and that kind of thing here. So this will be a short intro remarks rather than a full academic talk. So many of you might be wondering, what is this buzzword, cognitive ontology? Work on cognitive ontology, as it's sometimes called, studies the structure of the human mind. So the question here is, what are the parts of the human mind that are scientifically legitimate categories? And here, the term cognitive ontology can refer to a scientific taxonomy of psychological categories. So, Freud's cognitive ontology included the ego and the id. Franz Gall's cognitive ontology included a sense of metaphysics and memory for numbers and a memory for words. Our current scientific ontology might include things like working memory, anger as a basic emotion, top-down attention, and so forth. Or, as I'll talk about, and as some of our speakers will talk about, cognitive ontology can also refer to a database, an explicit informatics effort to capture the structure of the mind. And this is from a paper by Saab and colleagues in 2008, trying to map the set of cognitive control constructs, things like working memory and response inhibition, to say, what are the components of cognitive control? Right? And a full cognitive ontology, and we'll see the cognitive atlas that Tony and Poldrack are working on, would be a systematic effort to categorize all of the hypothetical constructs of psychology in this way. The conference goal is to look at how neuroscience, how studying the brain, and here I mean broadly from behavioral genetics and neurobiology to neuroimaging, how does neuroscience inform our understanding of the scientific categories of psychology? That's the main question of the workshop. All of the talks will in some way explore this general theme. The question here, how can, so is neuroscience capable of radically revising our view of what sorts of psychological kinds there, or how does it, in fact, change our view of the taxonomy of psychological kinds? That's the question we're here today. And there's some proposals I'm going to talk about in the intro, so empirical work that's already out there, and discussions that philosophers are already having, that proposes ways that this would go. And so one proposal is that we can use neuroscience to identify novel cognitive constructs. So we can use neuroscience maybe to identify a new computation that deserves to be part of our scientific understanding of the mind. Another way which we'll see is explicitly testing the validity of psychological constructs, the sort of thing that cognitive psychologists do with tasks all the time, using neuroimaging. So trying to use neuroimaging data as a measure of what's called convergent and discriminant validity. And there's a sort of idea underlying these proposals that each item in a cognitive ontology, like working memory, response inhibition, anger, will refer to a mechanism in the brain. And some of our speakers engage with or challenge that idea. And so the goal of this conference is to bring together people in philosophy and people in psychology and people in neuroscience who are interested in this question, which, in some ways is the question, what is the scientific status of the mind-brain relationship, in a sense. So I have a background in philosophy of science, and I wanted to note that developing taxonomies is one of the activities that scientists frequently engage in. So biologists will develop taxonomies depicting the relationships between animals, and chemists have developed a periodic table of elements, which talks about what the basic constituents of matter are. And psychology does taxonomy too, as many of you know. And so, for example, when you turn to a cognitive psychology textbook and you look at the section on memory, you find a taxonomy that looks something like the one that we saw in the biological domain, where you have different types. So you have short-term memory and long-term, and then in long-term memory you have explicit or declarative versus implicit or procedural. And so psychologists are in the business of trying to map what the parts of the mind are that we should allow into a scientific taxonomy. And in the course of science, our taxonomies will change over time, and so there never was a periodic table that had earth, water, air, fire, and ether on it. But if they had decided to make a periodic table at a certain time in ancient Greece, they would have had 5 elements on it. But the quintessence Aristotle's said. So over time, this taxonomy has been revised radically, and more categories have been developed. So in fact, something similar has happened in the history of psychology, which actually recapitulates some of this structure where a few sort of basic categories are then conceptually refined and divided out, and in fact, multiplied. So Plato argued for a tripartite psyche or soul consisting of the rational, the spirited or emotional, and the appetitive, which is a gloss on Plato's theory. But then if you go from antiquity to the 19th century with the work of the phrenologist Franz Gall, who attempted to link convolutions of the skull to mental, to organs of the brain and to the parts of the mind, Gall had something like 30 faculties, right? And this is just a slice of the cognitive atlas now being developed, which is a very small portion of the entire attempt to codify an ontology of psychology. And you can see that we already have dozens and dozens. So we may have hundreds or thousands, I'm not quite sure of the exact number of constructs currently. So philosophers have noted that this taxonomic revision takes a couple of interesting forms, kind of conceptual patterns. And one of them is either lumping or splitting, right? So if you ask the question, well, how do taxonomies in science change over time? One of the ways is either the creation of new branches or the merging of existing constructs. And this is called lumping and splitting in some of the recent philosophical literature. A canonical example of splitting would be this fork here in the tree between declarative and procedural memory. So Scoville and Miller's work with HM, who had bilateral lesions in the hippocampus and themselves, was able to have very impaired performance on declarative memory, but intact performance on this procedural memory start line task, right? So here's a case where, as the story goes, brain data sort of caused people to split the category of memory into 2 distinct kinds. It turns out that's kind of a not fully true history of how that all went down, but we'll just kind of use that for now. In addition to splitting, and here I'm still using the example of memory, there are also lumping, where what are initially taken to be different kinds are understood to have, to be some sort of unified kind, or to be the result of some unified mechanism. A putative example of lumping, although he may agree or disagree, is Felipe de Brigard's recent work on episodic hypothetical thinking. So there's research in neuropsychology suggesting that people with impairments in their ability to remember the past also have impairments in remembering the future. And likewise, there are neuroimaging studies, of which DeBergard's been a part of, that suggest that really the same core network of brain structures are engaged when people remember what could have happened, so counterfactual simulations about the past, when they remember what did happen, and when they project and plan to the future. So DeBergard might be saying, look, we shouldn't really talk about these aspects of our minds as different. We should talk about this capacity to project ourselves into temporally or counterfactually distant situations. So in addition to lumping and splitting, we also have the wholesale elimination of kinds from scientific taxonomies. This is an idea that was popularized by Paul and Patricia Churchland, philosophers who argued that all of our cherished mental concepts like belief and desire and love would someday be eliminated in favor of scientific concepts like dopamine rushes and so forth. And we've certainly seen in the history of psychology the wholesale elimination of taxonomic categories. So, today if you have Freud's division between the id and the ego and the superego, this has really gone the way of, phlogiston in chemistry, or, witches in psychiatry, or, the idea that the gods would move the sun around the sky with a chariot. So that's elimination. So bearing in mind these very general points about scientific taxonomy and that psychologists are involved in this kind of project too, we'll turn to the main meat of this conference, which is the relationship between the science of the brain and our cognitive ontologies. So I'm going to go with a few recent empirical examples where people have argued that we should actually use neuroscience to test or overturn or revise or evaluate the ontology of psychology. And I'll just put a plug in that the work of Talia Arconi and Russ Poldrack, who's our keynote, suggests a certain strategy that we might have in the background, which is systematize the taxonomy, so get really clear about what we think the hypothetical mental constructs are, which psychologists have not always done, and that's part of the interest in initiatives like the Cognitive Atlas, and then use neuroscience as a test or measure of the goodness of that ontology. So that's sort of the general project of which I'm going to talk about 3 flavors. So the first way that neuroscience might influence our cognitive ontology is the discovery of novel items in the ontology or constructs. I'll just sort of use those terms interchangeably. And this comes from a paper by Kathy Price and Carl Friston in 2005, but is also something you can find as a very general theme in cognitive neuroscience right now. So Price and Friston were asking, what is the function of the visual word form area, which is also posterior lateral fusiform gyrus? And they looked at a set of tasks that were known to activate the visual word form area, which some people were saying was a cortical module dedicated to recognizing written characters in your language. And they found that actually the visual word form area, so-called, was engaged in a ton of different tasks. Braille reading, which is an example of sort of letters but not vision, or even deciding whether a picture is an animal or an artifact, which is a semantic task which seems to have nothing to do with either touch or reading per se. Some motor tasks where you would see a certain shape and that would prompt you to perform a certain action, and then the visual word form area would come online with that. And so what they hypothesized is, well, look, the problem here, so it seems like this region performs a bunch of different functions. Price and Friston said, no, I think brain areas really perform one function. We've just categorized the function of this part of the brain incorrectly. And so they want to keep this idea that each brain region has some kind of function, and just say, yeah, we can account for all of these cases of activation by changing the function. They put forth the hypothesis that the visual word form area performs what they call sensory motor integration. Now, some people, including the philosopher Colin Klein, who will speak later, have worried that this is a really vague label, right, that could be describing sort of what the whole brain does or what any part of the brain does. But I think this is really a placeholder. The sort of conceptual idea here is that sensory motor integration is indicating whatever computation it is that the visual word form area performs, right? It's not really about words, but there's some perhaps spatial computation it does that enables it to be part of Braille reading and such. Now, we're not compelled to accept that, but that's the view. Notably in this paper, Price and Friston actually introduced this term, cognitive ontology, and liken it to projects that are going on in genetics and in proteomics and biology. So biologists will actually create large-scale databases of genes and enzymes and hypothesized relationships, say causal, between them. And in this paper, Price and Friston argued that we ought to do the same thing with psychology. So this is part of the introduction of the cognitive ontology term. So we should have things like phonology and semantics and orthography and just get this structure really clear. The move they make in the paper that's more radical is to say, well, it looks like the fusiform, or sorry, the visual word form area is involved in both word form and naming animals or something like that. And so in this conventional ontology, there's this pluripotent mapping from the region to the item. But what we should do is develop a new item, sensory motor integration, and do away with the separateness of those. And so whether or not you like the sensory motor integration theory of the visual word form area, I think the idea is really provocative, actually, that cases of an area seeming to do a bunch of different functions, there may be some kind of computation we haven't specified or some kind of function at another level of description that we can use. Maybe a good example would be the anterior insula. So, the insula is sort of one of these big offenders of the brain that you want to say what it does, and it seems to do everything, right? So the insula is implicated in studies of cravings for food. It's involved in primary gustation. It's involved in attention and working memory and a whole host of things. And there's a series of studies, partly by Manon and Udden, that use just a really simple oddball kind of paradigm where you take a sensory stimulus that's sort of at a low key, either in a visual domain or in a tactile domain, and then suddenly introduce an oddball. And they've found that the insula seems to be activated in all of these cases. And so they've developed a theory that the insula is not really about your interoception, it's not really about cravings, it's about it's a computation that detects changes in your environmental milieu. Did you say 5? A more explicit proposal, so one way that neuroscience could affect our cognitive ontology is by discovering new computationally defined functions. Another way is it could be used to test whether or not an ontology that we've developed is a good one by seeing if the brain sort of respects our ontology. So I'll briefly describe here a study, a really cool study by Leonardowitz and colleagues, Poljack is here as an author, which tested a hypothetical cognitive control ontology with neuroimaging. And so what they did is they took the Saab et al. Ontology, which separates working memory from task switching, where you're supposed to connect a bunch of dots by letter, but you're switching each trial by letter and number, so you're supposed to switch, versus response inhibition, where maybe you have a distractor and you're supposed to saccade away from it, right? And they wanted to see whether a pattern classifier trained on neuroimaging data can do a good job at discriminating those things from one another. And so the basic idea is we say, okay, this is what your brain looks like on the thing we're calling response inhibition, this is what the brain looks like on the thing we're calling task switching. If the pattern classifier can tell them apart, the neural signature must be quite different. If the pattern classifier does a bad job telling them apart, maybe they're just the same, different names for the same underlying brain process. And so sort of denouement of this paper is showing pairwise pattern classification scores where they test every construct against each other. So can it tell working memory from task switching based on neuroimaging data? It does really well at that. But they note that so-called task switching, right, which we have things like the trail making task for, are not distinguishable sort of below chance from response selection and response inhibition. And so they argue in the paper that task switching probably doesn't refer to a separate brain mechanism. We should discard it as a separate item from our ontology, which is a really provocative idea that we should actually use neuroimaging as the validation of our psychological constructs. Even more radical, but I'll just sort of mention it in passing, in 2012, Lindquist et al. Used a large-scale meta-analysis of brain imaging studies of emotion to argue that there is no brain region, contrary to what basic emotion theory says, that's specialized for a basic emotion like anger or fear, and therefore we should be suspicious of these emotion categories, right? So if it doesn't correspond to some distinctive mechanism in the brain, maybe it's not really an emotion. The last thing, I'll just have to go quite quickly through a few things, but Poldrak and Yarkoni have also been involved in some large-scale sort of bottom-up or data-driven efforts to develop predictive models of the way that tasks influence brain activation to sort of derive a hypothetical set of neural constructs, some of which might be different than the psychological ones we already have. So we'll have some speakers who will talk about this kind of big data way of doing cognitive ontology, which is different from the ones before. So there's a few big philosophical questions that come out of this empirical work. One is there such a thing as a true cognitive ontology? Is there a periodic table of mental kinds, and what benefit would having this be to psychology or psychiatry? As I noted before, there's the question of, well, is it true? There seems to be an assumption in a lot of this research that our ontology is only good if every item refers to some brain mechanism. So, is this an assumption that we ought to take on board? And finally, a question of what is the relationship between the scientific ontology of psychology and some of the ways that we talk about ourselves, like responsibility or the will or the self, and so forth. So this is just a picture of Linnaean classification system. A debate at the time was whether the systems they were unearthing were natural or not, right? Are they really reflecting the structure of plants, or are they reflecting just our convenience and our contrivances, right? This is sort of this idea that there's something neo-phrenological about some of these debates, right? That we still want to have this view where each mental organ in the brain corresponds in a one-to-one way with our psychological faculties, but we just have different faculties in different widgets. Right. So the last things I'll say, those are my remarks about the philosophical themes of the conference. Because we have a couple speakers talking about this, I'll just mention these issues are really salient as well in psychiatry. So a lot of researchers in psychiatry think that the categories that we've inherited from the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual are actually heterogeneous lumpings of underlying disease, and that in fact, once we develop really good neural and cognitive and genetic markers, we can resort these categories into new ways of understanding psychiatric disorders, which are here called biotypes. So we'll hear one talk from Robin Bloom on this topic. And as I said, there's just this question of what is the relationship between sort of our everyday mental concepts that we use to normatively evaluate people, like is impulsive, is irresponsible, is the acting like their self, and the things that we posit like cognitive control elements. So one might be the relationship between self-control and cognitive control constructs, and the other might be work like the philosopher Elizabeth Schechter is doing on what split brain patients could tell us about the nature of self-motor consciousness. So we have a wonderful schedule for you guys that you can see here on our printed programs. And I'll just go through and show you some of the awesome speakers we have. So we have Brian Bogdan from WashU talking about topics in behavioral genetics and neuroscience. We have Felipe de Brigard of Duke University winning an award here, looking very happy. Talia Yarkoni from the University of Texas in Austin is going to be teleconferencing in. We had something unfortunate come up at the last minute, but we'll be talking about some new work. This is Russell Poldrak of Stanford, who's our keynote speaker. We'll hear this evening. We have Sarah Robbins, University of Kansas. We have Carl Kraber here from WashU, going to be talking about some of the big philosophical questions. Robin Bloom, Michigan State University and Lyman Briggs College. Chandra Sripada, University of Michigan, Philosophy, Psychiatry. And Julia Haas of Rhodes College. And my co-organizer for this, who is, I believe, in Australia, and also will be teleconferencing in, is the eminent philosopher of neuroscience, Colin Klein. Okay, so the last things I want to say are some hearty thank yous. Sorry for going over a tiny bit. I really want to thank Duke University, the Summer Seminars in Neuroscience and Philosophy program, That's a program that is really fantastic, and you should look into it. The John Templeton Foundation, Washington University Philosophy, and Psychological and Brain Sciences for generous funding. I also really want to thank people for organization and assistance because this was a monumental effort on a lot of people's parts. So thanks to Colin Klein and Nick Pacheco, Ben Henke. Ben and Emily, you guys stand up? Yeah, so these are my co-organizers on the ground. You can ask them about anything. Thanks also to Felipe de Brigard, Ron Mallon, Dina Barch, Paul Craver, Laura Stewart, Rachel Dunway, Jerry Applecamp, Jay UK, Jeremy Henry, Will Fleischer, Gracie Bloke, Austin Andrews, and Judith Carlisle for driving people around and assisting in various ways. I also wanted to give a special thanks, which we already had you guys clap for, to Ben and Emily. So there's this part where you give special thanks to people who helped you out a lot. Ben and Emily have done absolutely heroic things for me in helping organize this conference in a way that's so above and beyond the call of duty that I think, this is less like the normal special thanks to these people and more like that moment in The Lord of the Rings where Aragorn tells all the people of whatever fictional place that is that the hobbits bow to nobody, and then everyone in the kingdom bows to the hobbits. So that's I'll end there. Thank you guys.